From TLDR News, this is your daily briefing for Thursday, the 14th of April 2022. Good afternoon. Today we'll be discussing some of the biggest stories, including the ongoing Israeli attacks and Amazon's new 5% levy. We'll also be answering today's big question: what's happening in the French presidential election, as well as discussing the UK's plans to send asylum seekers to Rwanda. But first, the Russian withdrawal. Russian forces began to regroup around Donbass, having withdrawn from Kiev and Chernihiv oblasts in the north of Ukraine. Russian forces began their withdrawal in late March and were completely out of Kiev by April the 5th. For the last week, Russian forces have failed to make significant gains, but Russian forces have redeployed around Donbass, and analysts reckon that there could now be some 60 to 70,000 Russian troops in the region. For context, Russia and Ukraine previously had similar numbers of troops, in the region of around 40,000 each. There have been reports that Russia is struggling to mobilise troops, which would explain the delay between withdrawal from Kiev and the offensive in Donbass, which hasn't started yet. Staying on the topic of Ukraine, the US has been rather outspoken about the war in recent days, with Biden yesterday characterising Putin's actions in the region as a genocide. Today, the US has gone further with their support, offering some $800 million of support to Zelensky's administration in the form of artillery, armoured vehicles and helicopters. Specifically included in the support are 11 Mi-17 helicopters, 18 howitzers, 40,000 artillery rounds, 300 Switchblade drones, 12 radar systems and landmines. To ensure that the Ukrainians use the equipment effectively, the US are also pondering how best to train those who will use the equipment. So far, it seems, the plan is to pull some handlers from the battlefield, train them and send them back to train others. This is what's known as the train the trainers approach. Boris Johnson has today announced plans to send some asylum seekers who arrive in the UK over 4,000 miles away to Rwanda, in a move widely condemned by refugee and human rights organisations. The aim is to undermine and break the business of people smugglers, Johnson says. The £120 million trial will see mostly single males who cross the channel relocated to the small African country, where they will have access to legal services and given the opportunity to build a new life, the Prime Minister said. Refugee organisations have described the plan as cruel and inhumane, and raised concerns about Rwanda's human rights record. Labour has described it as unworkable, unethical and extortionate, with other parties equally critical of the moral and economic implications of the plan. In other news today, violence continues to escalate as Israel steps up its military activities in the occupied West Bank, following a string of deadly terror attacks that killed more than a dozen Israelis. In the last 24 hours, 5 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli forces during arrests, raids and clashes in several West Bank towns and cities. Prime Minister Naftali Bennett had previously warned that the country is now on the offensive and there will be no limits to its response. The growing violence comes during an upcoming overlap of Ramadan and Passover, which has historically heightened tensions, particularly around holy sites. In the last story today, Amazon has announced that it will be adding a 5% fuel and inflation surcharge to fees that it charges its third-party sellers who use their fulfillment service. In a notice to these sellers, Amazon argued that its costs had risen during the COVID-19 pandemic due to increases in hourly wages, hiring more workers, and building more warehouses. This is despite the fact that Amazon's profits in the pandemic increased by around 80%, and Jeff Bezos himself increased his wealth by over $80 billion. The note sent to sellers went on to say that Amazon had absorbed costs wherever possible, but in 2022, when they'd expected things to go back to normal, they were hit with soaring inflation and fuel prices. As such, they had to pass some of the costs on to sellers, resulting in the 5% surcharge. This new fee will take effect from the 28th of April. That's all we have time for on YouTube today, but if you want more, including discussions about the latest in the French election and the UK's new Rwanda asylum seeker plan, then watch the extended edition of the daily briefing over on Nebula. Nebula subscribers not only get everything you've already watched ad-free, but also an extended edition of the show every single day, available to watch on Nebula or stream on your podcast app of choice. So if you want to support the channel and get a more extensive daily briefing every day, you'll want to sign up. And there's good news. Our friends at CuriosityStream, the streaming service which offers some of the best documentaries, is offering a deal whereby you can get both platforms, CuriosityStream and Nebula, for less than $15 a year. That's all the best documentaries you could want on CuriosityStream, and then more TLDR on Nebula, including the extended briefing, other full exclusive TLDR videos, and it's always ad-free. Click the link below to get both services for less than $15 a year and support the channel.